The Nikon Z 14-30mm F4S lens versus the Tamron 16-30mm F2.8 Di3 VXD G2 Z mount lens. Now, which one of these ultra-wide zoom lenses should you buy? Find out next. Well, this is actually going to be a bit of a tough one because both of these lenses are actually very good. So I'm not going to mess around. We've got a bit to get through in this video, so let's rip into it. So let's start off by having a look at both these lenses side by side. You can see that the Nikon is just that tad shorter than what the Tamron is. I'd say it's roughly about 1 centimeter, but that is with the Nikon lens closed. Let's see what happens when you open that up. So now with the Nikon out at its minimum focal length of 14mm, it's actually now longer than the Tamron lens. Now, while I've got both lenses like this, I want to show you something. With the Nikon lens, you'll notice when I zoom in and out, going from 14 to 30mm, you'll see that the zoom goes in and out. It's that type of lens where it extends out and comes back in when you're doing that zoom. Whereas with the Tamron, you'll notice it's got an internal zoom. I can go from 16 to 30mm and it doesn't change in size. So that internal zoom is actually very good for when you're out in dusty conditions or something like light rain or snow, because that helps the weather sealing with this particular lens. When it comes to little fine dust particles, they can gather inside that Nikon type of extended zoom where you go in and out. There is that little slightest possibility that fine dust particles can get inside this lens. However, in saying that, with the Tamron lens, you'll notice on the front, the lens when you zoom it in and out, now granted it has an internal zoom, but the front element moves in and out of the barrel. So again, that does make this a little bit susceptible to those little fine dust particles entering your lens. Now the simplest thing to cover that is simply buy a UV filter and put it on front of the Tamron lens. Weight for the Nikon, it weighs in at 485 grams, whereas the Tamron lens, it weighs in at 450 grams. So when you pick up both these lenses, you can definitely tell that the Tamron is that ever so slightly lighter in its weight. The aperture range difference on the Nikon, it goes from f4 to f22, whereas on the Tamron, it goes from f2.8 to f16. Minimum focus distance on the Nikon is 28 centimeters, and that is right throughout the zoom range from 14 all the way through to 30mm. Whereas on the Tamron at 16mm, the minimum focus distance is just 19 centimeters. Whereas at 30mm, it's 30 centimeters. Let's have a look at how that looks with these example shots. This comparison is with both lenses at their widest focal lengths and at their minimum focusing distances. You can see the Tamron gets right in close to your subject, much, much closer. And the bokeh in the background is more pronounced due to the wider f2.8 aperture compared to the Nikon. So the framing actually looks very different between these two lenses. Okay, so what about the maximum focal lengths of both these lenses at 30mm with the minimum focus distance of 28 centimeters on the Nikon and 30 centimeters on the Tamron? Now the playing field has evened up a bit. You can see with the Nikon, you can get just that slightest bit closer to your subject at 30mm. And when it comes to bokeh now, they are much closer, even though the Nikon is at f4 and the Tamron is at f2.8. So both of these lenses are very close in their focal lengths. Let's see if we can see visually if there's any sort of difference. Now this did surprise me a little. You wouldn't think the Nikon being only 2mm wider would make that big of a difference. But you can see in this example, the difference is noticeable. With both lenses at their maximum focal lengths of 30mm, you see they're pretty much exactly the same. When it comes to the focusing speed out of both of these lenses, they're pretty much on par with each other. I don't know, maybe the Tamron is just that tad bit snappier going from foreground to background subjects, but both were accurate in their focusing. In terms of filter thread sizes, they are quite different. The Nikon has an 82mm filter thread, whereas the Tamron, it has a 67mm filter thread. So filters for the Nikon lens may just be that tad more expensive than filters for the Tamron lens. Tamron have consistently kept their filter thread size of 67mm right throughout the holy trinity of F2.8 G2 lenses. Although we are still waiting on the 70-180 F2.8 G2 to come to the Nikon Z mount. But that makes it more convenient for those buying filters for the Tamron, as they can use them right throughout the whole range of those F2.8 G2 lenses. The Nikon lenses, however, are a little bit all over the shop when it comes to filter thread size. This particular lens, it has an 82mm filter thread, whereas something like the 24-70 F4S lens, well, it has a filter thread of 72mm. I guess if you did opt for the Nikon lens, and the best way financially would be to buy 82mm filters and then use step-up rings for your other Nikon lenses with smaller filter threads. When it comes to sharpness out of both of these lenses, they are both so close. I think the Nikon might be just that tiny bit sharper or crisper for some of the test shots I took, but not by that much when both lenses are at their widest apertures. Okay, so let's now talk about a very important one, and that is the price difference between these two lenses. Now, I'm going to use Australian dollars. The Nikon 14-30mm here in Australia retails normally for approximately $2,300. The Tamron retails for $1,799. So that's a $500 difference, and that may sway you as to which lens you might buy. However, please keep in mind, I have seen this Nikon lens when it's on special, sometimes throughout the year, it drops to prices like $1,900. So that then brings it more closer to the Tamron's pricing. However, that's not to stop Tamron in the future of dropping their price as well. Now, those of you who regularly watch my channel will know I love doing landscape and wildlife photography. I do a bit of astro too. So let me talk from a landscape photographer's point of view. When it comes to aperture doing landscape, I mostly stay around f8 to f11. So having a lens like the Nikon with minimum aperture of f4 doesn't really bother me. So we've had a very good look at both of these lenses. Now to the question, it's crunch time. Which one of these ultra wide zoom lenses should you buy? This is going to be tough. Okay, let me put it this way. I own this Nikon lens. This Tamron lens is just a loaner from Tamron Australia. That being said, would I be running out and selling this Nikon lens on the second-hand market to go and buy this Tamron lens? And the answer to that is no. Now, the reason for that is because I'm happy to use this Nikon as my wide-angle landscape lens. But when I do astro, I use the Viltrox 16mm f1.8 lens when I need a faster lens. But say for example, I didn't own an ultra wide zoom lens. I didn't have this Nikon lens and I was buying a lens for the first time for my Nikon Z camera. Then I'd actually be opting for this Tamron lens. And the reason for that is because I believe it's more versatile in its uses than the Nikon lens. And that is primarily due to its f2.8 aperture. You can not only use it for landscape, but for astro, real estate, weddings, travel, and more. In terms of convenience, it's kind of like having a mixture of both the Nikon 14-30mm and the Viltrox 16mm f1.8 rolled into one lens. I could leave this Tamron lens on my camera and I could do both landscape and astro together with it. So if I was traveling constantly and wanted to keep space and weight down, then this Tamron 16-30mm f2.8 G2 lens is perfect for that. If I was going to somewhere like Iceland or New Zealand, then I could be doing landscape during the day and shooting stars or the aurora at night with the Tamron. If you still haven't made up your mind which one of these lenses you should buy, I've actually done individual reviews of each of these lenses and I'm going to leave you those right here and here. Well guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video has helped you decide. Never stop creating. I'll see you next time.